Imagine for a moment a galaxy in which we are victorious. Picture the spread of the contra-immaterial nodal matrix across world after world until all the known stars burn cold and clean beneath its shroud, and the filth of the other space is swept away. Now tell me, shall we allow these flesh-shod vermin to deny us that destiny? I think not.
In media, robots are usually just around to help as a regular part of society, a safer way to talk about deeper topics like racism, or in the case of today, being drones with one goal in mind: complete annihilation. Though, as always, that was just the surface level of this faction, and over time it was shown that they are more than just a Terminator reference. It's time to talk about the Necrons, Warhammer 40k's undead faction. The Necrons were originally introduced as Chaos Androids, but were expanded upon in 2nd edition, and given a fully playable army in 3rd edition. Their whole playstyle was slow, war of attrition tactics, and their units being able to revive dead models and their vehicles healing any damage received. They're equipped with devastating ancient technology that atomizes their enemies. This was to give a stark contrast to the Tau army, who was released at the same time, the oldest faction along with the youngest faction. You'd think this would make those two rivals, but the Necrons' rival in 40k is the Eldar, surprisingly enough. Originally, the Necron story had them be mindless slaves to a group of eldritch gods known as the Catan. However, over time, their story was expanded, and we learned that the Necrons and their dynasties were a lot more complicated, and that their nobility had retained their personalities, whereas the common foot soldier didn't, meaning that we could have stories focused on Necron politics and characters, like the Twice Dead King series and the hilarious The Infinite and the Divine book. 500 Worlds would confirm that both sides of the coin were true, however, that there are Necrons who are mindless destroyers alongside the ones who have personalities. Who are the Necrons, though? Where do they come from? Why are they such a huge threat to the galaxy? And why are their characters so stupidly powerful? Like, we have a guy who has a time machine, and a guy who owns an entire planet that he uses as a museum and zoo. So, let's not waste any time and get into the history and details of the Necrons. The Necron story begins millions of years ago, with their original homeworld being somewhere hidden in what we know now as the Halo Stars, a place in the galaxy known to be a shit show at best and an utter hellhole at worst. They are known as the Necron tier back then, and were unfortunately born on a planet whose sun was unstable. Its radiation was bombarding the planet and the Necrons fled underground, but the damage was done. The radiation affected the Necrons and gave them extremely short lifespans, and this short lifespan went on to affect their culture and view on the universe. The Necron tier lived in massive, tomb-like cities due to their short lifespans. It was just easier to build around the idea of death. Death was everywhere for the Necron tier, and eventually, the species developed faster than light travel and fled their home system, trying to break the cycle of death and despair. They colonized worlds around the galaxy and began breeding programs to rebuild their population. However, the damage to the Necron tier's DNA was too deep, and no matter how many generations they were removed from their original homeworld, they kept dying very quickly. The Necron tier was doomed to be a species with extremely short lifespans. However, the Necron tier's luck would seemingly turn around when they encountered an ancient, powerful race known as the Old Ones, a race of extremely powerful aliens who could not only influence reality by merely thinking about it, but also create life and change it on a whim if they so chose. This miracle was seen as a blessing to the Necron tier, hoping to finally dig themselves out of the death spiral their race was stuck in. So, the Necron tier began to court the Old Ones, wishing to be friends and build a relationship. Eventually, asking the Old Ones if they could fix the Necrons' genetics and remove that damage that was killing them. And this, my friends, is the very thing that gave us the Warhammer universe. You see, The Old Ones are incredibly powerful, but that power came from what they called the Empyrean, or what we know as the Warp. The Warp, back in those days, was comparable to a calm ocean, and the Old Ones understood that they shouldn't mess with it more than they had to. They understood that messing with the natural order of things was going to rebound hard and disturb the balance. The Old Ones, although sympathetic to the Necron tier, sadly turned them down. Of course, they didn't fucking explain what I just explained to you, though, leading to the Necron tier, who understandably felt cheated and wronged, declaring a desperate war on the psychic frogs. This war turned into the event called the War in Heaven, a galactic war that would see the Necron tier attempt to fight the Old Ones. However, this is a race with the physical body of skeletons and the lifespan of flies, going up against a race who could crush plants with a single stroke of their finger. It was a one-sided war, and the Necron tier began to lose so badly that they fell into civil war due to conflicting politics, beliefs, and opportunistic backstabbing. This sadly led to the Necron tier fleeing back into the Halo stars, and they ended up right back where they started, their homeworld. Although with their new technology, they made a discovery. Turns out, their sun wasn't naturally unstable. It was being messed with by a strange ball of gas that was feeding on it. Seeing this, and wanting to understand why the hell it was eating their sun, the Necron tier scientists built the thing a body of living metal. Once the thing was inside a body that could communicate, it introduced itself as Azagorod, the Nightbringer, a being known as a Catan, an ancient enemy of the Old Ones. Hearing this, and seeing the power of the Catan, the Necron tier began to not only track down more of Azagorod's race and build bodies for them, but also began to worship them as gods. As the Catan's physical numbers grew, a Catan by the name of Mephet Ron began to court the Necron leader Cesaric, the Silent King, playing on the king's fear, paranoia, and hatred for the Old Ones. Mephet Ron convinced him that if he let the Catan empower the Necron tier, they could defeat their common enemy. The Silent King, in desperation to stop his people's civil war and destruction, agreed to the deal. And oh boy, did that monkey's paw have plans for him! The Catan built great spires and ordered the Necron tier people to enter them. And they did, only for the Catan to pull the wool out from under the Silent King after his transformation. Mephet Ron revealed that his name means the Great Deceiver, and that the Silent King just handed over his people to be mindless slaves to the Catan, with only Cesaric retaining his individuality and personality, because it was funnier to the Deceiver to have him watch his people be mindless slaves. Though the Catan would keep their promise, and help the Necrons destroy their hated foes. The War in Heaven took a drastic turn, as the Catan and their undying legions swept across the galaxy, murdering everything in their path. No one was spared from the tide of death, and the Old One's psychic powers proved to be less than useful against the undying living metal. In response, the Old Ones created several species to fight back against the Necrons. The Orks were the major one, but it's debated if the Old Ones actually created the Eldari or not. However, it would be the Eldari that caused the beginning of the end for this war. The Eldari had a trickster god of their own named Shigarok, the Harlequin god, who moved on the Catan and began to spread a lie, that by devouring and absorbing their fellow Catan, it would make that individual much stronger. This led to infighting among the Catan, allowing not only the Old Ones and their allies to strike back, but giving the Silent King an opening to rebel against those who shackled his race. Taking control of his legions, the Silent King's rebellion defeated the Catan, destroying some, but having to shatter and seal the rest away. After this, Cesaric would quietly order the last of his surviving legions to return to their tomb worlds and enter a long stasis. The mindless drones complied and enter a long hibernation. Cesaric then destroyed the command protocols that kept his people enslaved and mindless, and once the last tomb was sealed, Cesaric took his personal ship and exiled himself from the galaxy. And for millions of years, the Necrons slept. The galaxy slowly recovered from the horrors that played out. Only for shit to get much worse while they slept! Eventually, on the planet Sanctuary 101, the Imperium of Man had their first recorded encounter with the Necrons. The Sisters of Battle Coven stationed on the world disturbed the tomb within the planet, and the Necrons came out and slaughtered the small defense force, leaving nothing behind but atomized wall markings and flayed corpses. From here, more and more tomb worlds began to awaken, finding a galaxy that, although filled with life, was also filled with war, misery, and darkness. With a new lease on life, the Necrons began to exterminate said life, and also reclaim their lost empire, seeing every other race as inferior and squatting on what was rightfully theirs. Though in modern 40k, things have gotten more complicated. With the return of Cesarec from his self-imposed exile, a new Necron civil war started, between those wishing to return to flesh and blood, and those who wish to stay immortal living metal skeletons. And with the Catan's agents such as Necrosaur returning, it appears that the Necron's path to controlling the galaxy is just as hopeless as everyone else's. Now, let's cover the Necrons' culture. The Necrons' culture, even before they returned to metal skeletons, was a culture based around death and abhorrence of life. Anything living is considered a gross insult to the Necrons, and they will happily destroy it. However, that is only one side of the coin. The Necrons have shown that their hatred for life has turned into a need to conquer and to make the Necrons the superior race of the galaxy, leading to two very different mindsets within the Necrons and their dynasties. Some want to kill everything because it needs killing, while the rest want to rebuild the Necron Empire. The Necrons inhabit multiple planets, but they live in underground massive tomb complexes. Their ancient cities were repurposed into massive complexes to not only keep the inhabitants safe during their long sleep, but also to be places where Necrons can be rebuilt. You see, when Necrons take damage, their bodies will regenerate and rebuild themselves. However, if the damage is too much for a Necron to rebuild from, their consciousness is sent back to the tomb world and their living metal body is rebuilt there, meaning that unless you destroy the tomb complex, the Necrons never truly lose and their numbers are never ending. However, due to the destruction of the command protocols, the ancient dynasties have been allowed to come back to power. The Necrons' nobles and lords regain their individuality and personalities. This has given the individual lords and noble courts tons of power, as the regular foot soldiers have only retained their need to obey and kill on their lord's command, meaning that unless it's a rival noble or lord, the dynasty rulers don't have much to worry about when it comes to their power base. However, with this power base, the Necrons' politics remain the same as their old dysfunctional ways. Old grudges between dynasties that are millions of years old resurfaced. It's not uncommon for a Necron lord to let a rival dynasty get destroyed just so their power can grow or stay the same. Hell, we're going to see that in action with Dawn of War 4's plot. A rival Necron tomb world is invading the planet Cronus to steal from the Cronus tomb world. This political climate has led to tons of problems and internal conflict within the Necron dynasties, and made all of them paranoid, making alliances between two or more dynasties short, and usually making them end in violence. There are also several other problems plaguing the Necrons, like the two viruses called the Destroyer and Flayer viruses. Now, these viruses are more like a computer virus, instead of a biological one, as these are things that infect a Necron's mind and sense of self. The Destroyer virus infects a Necron's mind and has them join the Destroyer cult. Their hatred of life becomes so extreme and dangerous that even their own allies distrust them. They will spend time not only killing the dynasty's enemies, but also going after everything else on a planet, from the largest living creature to the smallest microbe. These cultists change their bodies extensively, making themselves fully dedicated to destruction. The flare virus does, however, spread like an infection. If a Necron becomes infected by the flare virus, they become little more than a walking metal zombie, having an intense hunger for flesh, blood, and gore, altering their bodies to make slaughter easier by changing their hands into claw-like appendages to better flay their victims. They also wear the flesh and organs of their victims, turning into shambling hordes of flesh-covered monsters. And sadly, there appears to be no cure for it. This situation only got worse with the return of Necrosor, a Necron who appears to make both the Flare and Destroyer viruses much worse. And it appears that Necrosor is able to control these hordes for its masters, the Catan, who we should probably talk about. The Catan, as I said before, were the ancient enemies to the Old Ones, and are described by the Craftworld Eldar as being gods of the material plane. The Catan are extremely powerful, with only one or two ever being hinted at being fully destroyed, with the rest only being shattered and contained in massive vaults or endless tesseract labyrinths. But even a shard can prove to be extremely dangerous and deadly, as they are powered the same way the Chaos Gods are, through the emotions, thoughts, and feelings of mortals. However, the Necrons have been able to weaponize their former masters, using them as living batteries to power doomsday-level weaponry, or, if the situation becomes dangerous enough, to release the Catan shard and allow it to run wild all over the battlefield. Though plenty of Catan are dangerous on their own, there are three who we know by name that are somewhat active in the universe currently. Azagorod, also known as the Nightbringer, is the embodiment of death and hopelessness. It took on the aspect of the Grim Reaper, and is said to have influenced even humanity's perception of death. The Nightbringer's mere presence is enough to drain the life out of living creatures, and its gaze, even as a shard, will kill. Its scythe carves through even the most heavily armored units like nothing. Mephitron, also known as the Great Deceiver, is the embodiment of deception and trickery. Even as a single shard, the Deceiver can create grand illusions and warp reality to deceive its victims. It's powered through trickery and lies, and through these manipulations, it drives mortals mad. It can also scrap pretty well, being able to sunder titans with just its fists. Last but not least is Magladroth, also known as the Void Dragon. The Void Dragon is considered the strongest of the Catan, as it absorbs its power through machines and Blackstone, able to take over machines as well as absorb the materials that make up said machine. The Void Dragon is a nightmare for any armored military force, advanced civilization, or fleet that stands before it. The only shards known to exist are kept well guarded, though it's hinted that one of the Void Dragon's shards might be an ancient being known as the Dragon of Mars, who might have influenced the Imperium's Adeptus Mechanicus' religion. Now, let's move on to the major dynasties before we wrap up. As I said before, the Necrons are organized into dynasties. Each dynasty is ruled by a Pharaon, also called an Overlord, who then have their courts of nobles, who have their own duties to perform to keep their dynasty running. From the lowest cryptech doing research to improve the odds for their dynasty's success, to a talented lord leading their legions for their Pharaon. Each dynasty has a unique way of going about its organization and rule. The greatest of these dynasties starts with the Sawtek dynasty, currently ruled over by Pharaon Imhotep the Stormlord. The Necrons of this dynasty were seen for a long time as the Necrons of the galaxy, basically being the equivalent of the Ultramarines for the Necrons. A rapidly rising force within the galaxy, The Sawtek dynasty is quickly becoming a threat to the eastern fringe of the galaxy, as their forces endlessly march to the next conquest. Although, they are also now one side of the Necron civil war, with Imhotep the Stormlord siding against the returned Silent King, wanting to stay a metal immortal forever. Next up is the Silent King's own dynasty, the Caesar Khan dynasty. Though this dynasty has lost many of its tomb worlds to Eldar raids and other disasters, many Necron tomb worlds still bow to the Silent King. The Caesar Khan dynasty has some of the most ancient and dangerous warriors and weapons within the Necron race, with the privilege of following the strongest Necron around, the Silent King himself, whose power and presence alone can change the tide of any war. The Caesar Khan dynasty currently wants to return the Necrons to flesh and blood, which led them into civil war with Necrons like the Sawtek dynasty and Imhotep the Stormlord. After that, we have the Mefrit dynasty, infamous for creating devastating doomsday weapons made from captured stars. Mefrit was a reliable ally to the Silent King, even more so now that they are direct rivals to the Sawtek dynasty. Their location in Imperium Nihilus and in the Eastern Fringe has led them into constant conflict with both the Imperium and Sawtek, however, keeping them stuck in an endless quagmire. Next is the Nephric dynasty, located near the center of the galaxy's core. The Nephric dynasty was the richest and most violent of the Necron tomb worlds. However, this dynasty has slowly fallen into insanity and paranoia. Something happened to them during their great sleep, and it left the Pharaon and his courts paranoid and possessive to an extreme degree. They are currently in a never-ending war against the Thousand Sons Cult of Time. Then there is the Novak dynasty, who are brutal butchers and berserkers. The Novak dynasty marches to war covered in the blood of their enemies, specializing in close quarters combat and relishing the bloodshed. Though, after a war with the infamous Death Guard Traitor Legion, the dynasty has fallen on hard times due to special demonic plagues running through their systems. Even worse, they have been embroiled in the Fourth Tyrannic War with High Fleet Arachne. But they still found a way to send reinforcements to support the Silent King in the Pariah Nexus. Last but not least is the Nihilek dynasty. Seen as the traditionalists of the Necron dynasties, Nihilek is extremely defensive and isolationist. They want to protect their treasure worlds from invaders. If any non-Necron force enters their territory, the Nihilek dynasty will hunt down the intruders until they are utterly annihilated. No one escapes their wrath, and due to their traditional ways, they have sided with the Silent King in the Necron Civil War. The Necrons of modern 40k are more divided than ever. The Silent King returned in M41999 during the Third Tyrannic War, and the state of the galaxy and the threats within it horrified him. Though his goal is to return his people back to flesh and blood, with the Tyranids running rampant, the orks polluting the galaxy, and humanity being responsible for splitting the galaxy in half, the Silent King has begun an experiment to see what happens if he activates multiple devices called Blackstone Pylons. You can check that out in my Pariah Nexus video if you want the answers to how that's going. Not every Necron agrees with their Silent King though, as many love the fact that they don't have to worry about eating or sleeping or hearing the bitching and whining of their starving slaves, leading those like Imhotep to rebel against the Silent King, keeping the Necrons weakened and distracted. However, this civil war has seen ancient horrors and weapons unleashed that the Imperium and other factions unfortunately got caught up in the middle of. With the civil war ongoing, and now Necrosaurus faction finally making itself known, the Necrons seem far from taking over the entire galaxy, let alone wiping it out. But so long as their tomb worlds remain intact, and their bodies always rebuild themselves, the Necrons truly are a never-ending legion that threatens every living thing in the galaxy. And whoever wins the Civil War, they will either try to be the sole living beings in the galaxy, continue to be living metal skeletons, or return to being the slaves of the Catan. The Necrons in modern 40k are a great beginner army, with the ability to restore dead models or repair damaged units. This gives newer players a little extra security when planning strategies and wanting to hold objectives. Their units are also highly specialized, meaning that what a new player sees is what they get. If a unit is dedicated to killing tanks, they are dedicated to killing tanks. No need to stress about what else they do or what proper builds work best. However, this single-minded unit specialization makes Necron armies extremely inflexible, meaning that there are dedicated hard counters to your units. If a ranged unit gets stuck in melee, they're going to be unable to do their job. The same goes for melee units. With little to no shooting, your unit has little to no way of fighting back against units that can reliably run away from them. However, with a strong leadership stat, the ability to regenerate, and having some of the best weapons in the game, the Necrons make for an incredible beginner army, especially since a new edition is coming out soon as of this video's scripting. The Necrons are the oldest faction within the universe of 40k, and their story and characters have changed a lot from edition to edition, from mindless slaves to eldritch gods to complicated immortal dynastic conquerors. Their faction and story have remained one of the most popular out of the alien factions within 40k. Plus, it helps that painting them is extremely simple. Choose a metallic, then any other color for their energy, and you're good. Along with them having many popular characters, like Trazyn the Infinite and Orikin the Diviner. Now, when we come back, we'll be going back to a Warhammer event, the Plague War event, which is the event that started Warhammer's revival and brought us into its 8th edition. It was also the introduction of Primarch Mortarion as a playable character in modern 40k. Then after that, we have the Reign of Iron campaign, which will probably be the last event of 10th edition. So if you want to see those videos early, subscribe to the Patreon. Though if you can't join the Patreon, just subscribing, watching, and sharing my videos is more than enough. So until then, I'll see you all next time.